Look at the wreckage hanging from that gas station. This was a man who convinced himself he was a god. He didn't just want to rule Italy, he wanted Italy to desire him. He turned his own shirtless body into a religion, forcing a nation to kneel before a delusion of Roman power. This is the untold story of Benito Mussolini, Italy's most delusional dictator. The delusion began in a stone house in Predappio on July 29, 1883. Benito Amilcari, Andrea Mussolini, was born into a room that smelled of sweat and iron. He was not born into power, he was born into rage. His father, Alessandro, was a blacksmith and a drunkard, a violent socialist who hated the church and the state with equal venom. His mother, Rosa, was a quiet schoolteacher who prayed for a peace that never came. From the very beginning, Benito was a contradiction, torn between his father's chaotic violence and his mother's desperate need for order. As a child, he was terrifyingly silent. He did not speak a single word until he was 3 years old, watching the world with dark, unblinking eyes that seemed to be judging everyone around him. When he finally found his voice, he used it not to communicate, but to dominate. The violence was not learned, it was innate. By the age of 10, the future dictator was already displaying signs of the sociopathic behavior that would define his rule. He did not play with other children, he fought them. In 1892, he was sent to a boarding school run by Salesian monks, but he refused to submit to their discipline. During an argument in the cafeteria, he pulled a knife and stabbed a fellow student in the hand. There was no remorse, only a cold satisfaction in the power he held over the victim. He was expelled, but the lesson stuck. Violence was a shortcut to respect. A few years later, he stabbed another student. He stabbed a girlfriend in the arm. For the young Mussolini, the physical body, his own and others, was just a canvas for pain and domination. As a young man, he fled to Switzerland to avoid military service, living the life of a vagrant. He slept under bridges and stole food, dirty, hungry, and burning, with a toxic mix of shame and superiority. It was here, in the depths of poverty, that the great delusion began to take shape. He was a nobody, a starving Italian immigrant in a land of rich men, but in his head he was a giant. He wore a cheap medallion of Karl Marx in his pocket, but he didn't care about the working class. He cared about Benito Mussolini. He realized that to escape his misery, he didn't need money. He needed attention. He needed to be seen. He found his stage in journalism. He discovered that he had a talent for the written word, but not for the truth. He wrote like his father hammered steel, violent, loud, and dangerous. He realized that the public did not want complex arguments. They wanted sensation. They wanted blood. He learned to simplify everything into black and white, friend and enemy. He practiced his public speaking not to persuade, but to electrify. He would stand before a mirror for hours, studying his own reflection. He realized that he wasn't particularly handsome. He was short, with a heavy jaw and a bald head, but he could turn these flaws into weapons. He practiced rolling his eyes, widening them until the whites showed all around the iris, creating a gaze that looked manic, almost hypnotic. He jutted his jaw out to look aggressive. He was building a mask. When World War I broke out in 1914, the mask slipped into place. Mussolini, the socialist who had once preached neutrality, suddenly smelled an opportunity. He realized that peace was boring. Peace offered no glory for a man who wanted to be a Caesar. He betrayed his socialist comrades and began screaming for war. He wanted Italy to bleed because blood meant drama, and drama meant he could play the hero. He joined the army not out of patriotism, but to build his resume. His time at the front was unremarkable until a training accident left him riddled with shrapnel. It was a stroke of luck. He wasn't wounded by the enemy, but he let the world believe he was a martyr. Lying in the hospital bed, he groaned for the photographers. He learned that a wounded body is a political asset. He was no longer just a journalist. He was a survivor. By 1919, Italy was broken. The war was won, but the economy was destroyed. The streets were full of angry, unemployed veterans who felt betrayed by the government. Mussolini looked at this chaos and saw his opening. He gathered a group of criminals, intellectuals, and war veterans in a hall in Milan and founded the fascist movement. They had no real ideology. Their program was a confusing mix of left and right ideas, but Mussolini knew that ideas didn't matter. Appearance mattered. He dressed his thugs in black shirts to make them look like a unified army. He taught them the Roman salute. He gave them a sense of belonging. He replaced political debate with the castor oil treatment, forcing his opponents to drink laxatives and tying them to trees, humiliating them physically. It was juvenile, disgusting, and incredibly effective. The delusion deepened. Mussolini began to believe that he was the only man capable of saving Italy. He wasn't just seeking office, he was seeking worship. In October 1922, he staged the March on Rome. In his later propaganda, this was depicted as a glorious military conquest, with thousands of disciplined fascists seizing the capital. The reality was a farce. Mussolini didn't march. He took a comfortable sleeper train from Milan to Rome, waiting to see if the army would stop him. It was a giant bluff. He was gambling that the king, Victor Emmanuel III, was too weak to fight. He was right. The king panicked and invited Mussolini to form a government. The bluff worked. The actor had walked onto the stage and terrified the audience into applause. At the age of 39, Benito Mussolini became the youngest prime minister in Italian history. But he was not satisfied with being a minister. As he sat in his massive office, he began to strip away the mechanisms of democracy. He didn't want colleagues. He wanted an audience. He began to craft the image of Il Duce, the leader. He started to erase his past, the driftless vagrant, the draft dodger, the violent bully. All were scrubbed from the record. In their place, he constructed a new reality. He ordered the lights in his office at Palazzo Venezia to be left on all night, creating the myth that the Duce never sleeps. It was a lie, of course. He went home to sleep like anyone else. But the people walking past the building at 3 a.m. looked up at that lit window and felt a shiver of awe. They thought he was watching over them. This was the beginning of the true sickness. It wasn't just that he lied to the people. It was that he began to require the people to participate in the lie. He turned the entire country into a theater production. He began to obsess over his physical body, realizing that it was the most powerful tool he had. He was the first politician to understand the power of sex appeal in leadership. He wasn't a dry bureaucrat in a suit. He was a virile male. He started to remove his shirt for the cameras. He wanted the Italians to see his chest, his arms, his sweat. He wanted to be the lover of the nation. But beneath the posing, the paranoia was growing. He trusted no one. He created a secret police force not just to catch spies, but to monitor the applause. If the applause wasn't loud enough, it was treason. The man from Predappio had effectively killed Benito Mussolini and was now fully possessed by the character he had created, Il Duce. And Il Duce could not be wrong. Il Duce could not fail. Il Duce was a god, and gods do not tolerate reality. By the summer of 1924, the fascist experiment was on the verge of collapsing. The crisis was not caused by an army or a foreign power, but by a single body found in a shallow grave outside Rome. Giacomo Matteotti, a socialist politician who had meticulously documented the election, fraud, and violence of Mussolini's party, had been kidnapped and stabbed to death. Witnesses saw the car. The license plate was traced to Mussolini's inner circle. This was not a glorious revolution. It was a sloppy gangland hit. Mussolini was not projecting strength. He was paralyzed. For months, he barricaded himself in his apartment, suffering from severe ulcers and vomiting blood. He was terrified that the king would dismiss him, that the army would arrest him. He was a man waiting for the police to knock on the door, but the knock never came. The opposition hesitated and the king remained silent. Mussolini realized then that his enemies were weak, paralyzed by their own adherence to the rules. He decided to break the board entirely. On January 3rd, 1925, he entered the Chamber of Deputies. He looked ill, pale, and sweating, but he had calculated his move. He delivered a speech that effectively ended Italian democracy. He did not deny the violence. He claimed it. He challenged the parliament to impeach him, knowing they lacked the courage to do so. It was a blunt force trauma to the political system. When he finished, he sat down. Nobody moved. In that silence, the dictatorship was solidified. He had learned that if you act with enough aggression, people will assume you have the right to rule. With the opposition crushed, Mussolini began the systematic fabrication of Il Duce. This was no longer about politics. It was about branding. He needed to erase the image of the short, sick man who had nearly lost his nerve in 1924. He began to reconstruct his physical appearance to match the rhetoric of the regime. He shaved his head completely. In the 1920s, a bald head was typically a sign of age, but Mussolini forced a reinterpretation. He turned his skull into a symbol of hardness and modernity. It gave him a distinct silhouette, instantly recognizable on a poster or a coin. It stripped away the softness of a bourgeois politician and replaced it with something that looked like a weapon. He altered his posture and facial expressions. He studied photographs of himself and ruthlessly edited his own behavior. He realized that his natural smile was weak, so he banned it. He forbade photographers from capturing him smiling in public. Instead, he developed the Roman set. He thrust his jaw forward, creating an artificial underbite to simulate determination. He widened his eyes to an unnatural degree, holding the pose until it became a tic. He wanted to look constantly alert, constantly aggressive. This was not a natural expression. It was a physical performance maintained through constant muscular tension. He was turning his face into a logo. The regime began to project this face onto the physical reality of Italy. The cult of the Duce was not subtle. His image was plastered over billboards, stenciled onto farmhouses, and printed on millions of postcards. The most extreme example occurred during the 1934 referendum, where the Palazzo Braschi in Rome was covered by a massive facade featuring a disembodied face of Mussolini, just the eyes and the mouth set against a background of the word SI, repeated endlessly. It was a deliberate attempt to create a sense of omnipresence. The message was that the Duce was watching you, that he was the state, and that there was no alternative but to say yes. Mussolini then moved to weaponize his body. He understood that to lead a young and virile nation, he could not appear as a sedentary administrator. He launched the Battle for Grain, a campaign to increase domestic wheat production. He traveled to the fields of the Pontine marshes, stripped to the waist, and began to thresh grain alongside the farmers. This was a calculated stunt. The cameras were positioned low to make him look taller and more imposing. The newsreels were edited to speed up his movements, making him appear to work with superhuman energy. He wanted to show that he was physically stronger than any other leader in Europe. The reality was far different. Mussolini was not a Superman. He was a middle-aged man with serious health issues. While the newsreels showed him shirtless and sweating, they hid the fact that he was often in pain. He wore a truss to manage a hernia. He suffered from chronic gastric issues that forced him to survive on a bland diet of milk and boiled chicken. After the cameras stopped rolling, he would often collapse from exhaustion, but the propaganda machine filtered out these biological realities. They created a hermetically sealed image of a man who never tired, never aged, and never failed. He surrounded himself with a court of sycophants who reinforced this delusion. His ministers were terrified to bring him bad news. If production quotas were missed, they lied and said they were exceeded. If the people were unhappy, they reported that the crowds were jubilant. Mussolini stopped seeing the real Italy and began to see only the reflection of his own propaganda. He believed the staged rallies were spontaneous outpourings of love. He believed the rigged economic figures. The construct of Il Duce began to suffocate the man Benito Mussolini. He became a victim of his own censorship, cutting himself off from the feedback loops that keep a leader grounded in reality. He was driving the nation based on a map that he had drawn himself, a map that bore no relation to the terrain. The geography of the dictatorship narrowed down to a single room in the heart of Rome. By the mid-1930s, the Palazzo Venezia was no longer just a government building. It was the temple of the regime, and the Sala del Mappamondo was its inner sanctum. This office was designed not for work but for psychological warfare. It was a cavernous space, 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a high ceiling that seemed to swallow the air. The furniture was sparse. There were no chairs for guests. There was no waiting area. At the very far end, near the fireplace, sat a massive carved wooden desk. Behind it sat the Duce. The ritual of visiting Mussolini was a carefully calculated act of intimidation. When a minister, a general, or a foreign dignitary entered the room, they were forced to walk the entire length of the marble floor to reach him. The walk took time. It was noisy. Footsteps echoed against the stone, amplifying the visitor's isolation. Mussolini would not look up. He would remain bent over his papers or staring fixedly at the newcomer, silent and immobile like an idol. By the time the visitor reached the desk, they were breathless, self-conscious, and already in a state of submission. This was the architecture of dominance. It established, before a word was spoken, that Mussolini occupied a different plane of existence. He was the stationary center of the universe. Everyone else was a satellite orbiting his will. Inside this room, the machinery of the state was dismantled and replaced by the whims of one man. Mussolini grew increasingly bored with the actual mechanics of governing. He detested the details of economics. He fell asleep during budget meetings. He refused to read technical reports that contradicted his intuition. Instead, he relied on instinct. He believed he had a mystical connection to the flow of history that rendered statistics irrelevant. He began to accumulate cabinet posts, eventually holding 7 ministries simultaneously. He was the Minister of War, the Minister of the Interior, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and more. It was a physical and administrative impossibility. Papers piled up on his desk unread. Decisions were delayed or made impulsively based on his mood. The government of Italy became a chaotic extension of his nervous system. To fill the vacuum of competence, he surrounded himself with a court of sycophants. The most important of these was Achilles Starres, the secretary of the fascist party. Starres was a man of limited intelligence but fanatical loyalty, a bureaucrat who viewed fascism not as a political philosophy but as a religion of choreography. Starres was the stage manager of the regime. He understood that for the delusion to work, The people had to be kept in a constant state of performative tension. He invented the Passo Romano, the Roman step, a high-kicking goose step march borrowed from the German army. Mussolini loved it because it looked aggressive and virile, ignoring the fact that the short-legged Italian soldiers looked ridiculous doing it. Starus banned the handshake, declaring it bourgeois and soft. Italians were ordered to use the Roman salute, the raised right arm. He tried to ban the formal lay form of address in the Italian language. He obsessed over the design of uniforms, buttons, and medals. Under Starus, the party became a machine for generating useless rituals, keeping the population busy with the aesthetics of obedience so they wouldn't notice the hollowness of the policy. But the most potent ritual of all took place on the balcony. The small stone platform overlooking the Piazza Venezia became the most important square footage in Italy. This was where the dialogue between the Duce and the masses took place. Mussolini did not just give speeches, he conducted seances. He understood the psychology of the mob better than anyone. He knew that a crowd does not think, it feels. When he stepped out onto the balcony, he treated the sea of faces below him as a single female organism that needed to be seduced and mastered. He developed a specific vocal technique for these moments. He did not speak in long, flowing paragraphs. He spoke in staccato bursts. He punched the air with his words. He used silence as a weapon, pausing for uncomfortable lengths of time to let the tension build, standing with his hands on his hips, his chest inflated, his chin thrust out. He would ask rhetorical questions, screaming them into the microphone. Who do we owe our loyalty to? And the crowd, conditioned by years of Starus's drills, would roar back, to you, Duce. It was a feedback loop of narcissism. The louder they screamed, the more invincible he felt. The more invincible he looked, the louder they screamed. In those moments, breathing in the adoration of 100,000 people, Mussolini lost all contact with reality. He believed the roar of the crowd was a confirmation of his divinity. He forgot that the square was filled with party members who were required to be there, whose attendance was checked by the militia. He mistook coerced obedience for genuine love. This public performance of virility was mirrored by a private life that was equally performative and hollow. The regime sold Mussolini as the national lover, a man of boundless sexual energy. The reality was a grim mechanical procession of women through the Palazzo Venezia. These were not romantic trysts. They were medical necessities for his ego. Women, often petitioners, admirers, or even aristocrats, would be ushered into the Sala del Mappamondo in the late afternoons. Mussolini would rarely engage in conversation. There was no seduction. He would often not even remove his trousers or his shoes. The act was quick, brutal, and transactional. It was an assertion of power, a way to prove that he could take what he wanted. Afterward, the woman would be dismissed, and he would return to his desk, satisfied that the machine was still functioning. He kept his actual family hidden away. His wife, Rachele, was a peasant woman who refused to move to the Palazzo Venezia, preferring to stay in their private residence. She was the only person who treated him as a human being, which is perhaps why he kept her out of the public eye. The public Mussolini had to be unattached, belonging to everyone and no one. He had a mistress, Claretta Petacci, a young fanatical admirer who was obsessed with him. But even she was a prop, a mirror to reflect his own grandeur back at him. He did not love. He was only capable of being loved. Beneath the uniforms and the posturing, the Superman was rotting. The syphilis he had likely contracted in his youth was a ghost in his blood, though its direct effects are debated by historians. The specter of it haunted him. More immediately, he was plagued by a gastric ulcer that caused him agonizing pain. The man who projected an image of iron health lived on a diet of boiled chicken, rice, and milk. He was constantly dehydrated, constantly in discomfort. He suffered from mood swings that terrified his subordinates. One moment he was euphoric, planning empires. The next he was catatonic, convinced he was dying of cancer. He stopped listening to his doctors, suspecting them of being spies or assassins. He became his own physician, just as he was his own general and his own economist. By 1935, the isolation was total. Mussolini had constructed a world where truth was treason. When the economic sanctions from the League of Nations hit Italy, his advisors told him the economy was booming. When the Air Force grew obsolete, his generals told him it was invincible. He had successfully blinded himself. He stood on the balcony, looking down at the black-shirted legions, and saw a revival of the Roman Empire. He did not see the cardboard soles on the soldiers' boots. He did not see the fear in the eyes of the people. He saw only the reflection of his own desperate need to be great. The body politics had succeeded in creating a perfect facade, a shell of marble and bronze. But inside the shell, there was only a sick man and a silent room, waiting for a war that would shatter the glass. The year 1935 marked the moment when the delusion grew too large to be contained within the borders of Italy. The virile man could no longer be satisfied with threshing grain or draining swamps. The logic of the dictatorship was predatory. A god who does not conquer is merely a statue, and Mussolini was terrified of becoming static. He looked at the map of Africa and saw the solution to his midlife crisis. He did not see the harsh, unforgiving terrain of Abyssinia. He saw a stage for the revival of the Roman Empire. He needed a war. He needed it not for oil or gold or strategic security, but for the same reason an aging actor needs a comeback role, to prove he is still potent. The invasion of Ethiopia was sold to the Italian people as a civilizing mission, a glorious return of the legions. The reality was a grotesque mismatch that exposed the hollowness of fascist chivalry. Mussolini unleashed a modern military machine against an army of tribesmen armed with antique rifles and spears. But even this was not enough to satisfy his need for dominance. Frustrated by the slow pace of the advance and terrified that a long war would expose his army's logistical weaknesses, Mussolini ordered the use of poison gas. He personally authorized the dropping of mustard gas bombs on civilian villages and Red Cross hospitals. It was a war crime committed via telegram from the safety of the Palazzo Venezia. He wanted the world to fear him, and he believed that cruelty was the quickest route to respect. Back in Rome, he staged the psychological masterstroke of the campaign, the Day of Faith. On December 18, 1935, in a meticulously choreographed ritual of mass hysteria, he asked the women of Italy to donate their gold wedding rings to the state to fund the war. In exchange, they received cheap steel bands. It was a brilliant, sinister manipulation. By taking their rings, he was symbolically marrying the entire female population of Italy to the fascist state. Queen Elena herself was filmed dropping her royal ring into the crucible. Millions followed. Women stood in line to strip themselves of their most personal possessions, weeping with patriotic fervor. Mussolini had successfully implicated the entire nation in his crime. They were no longer just spectators, they were accomplices. When the news of the victory finally came, the crowds in Piazza Venezia were delirious. Mussolini stood on the balcony, bathing in the roar, convinced now that he was not just a politician, but a man of destiny who could bend history with his bare hands. But the victory in Africa was a narcotic, and the high was short-lived. It masked the rot inside the Italian military. The war had drained the treasury and worn out the equipment. A rational leader would have spent the next decade rebuilding and consolidating. But Mussolini was no longer capable of rational calculation. He was addicted to the adrenaline of conflict. When the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, he immediately jumped in, sending troops and planes to support General Franco. It was a strategic disaster. Italy gained nothing but dead soldiers and a depleted air force. But Mussolini could not help himself. He had to be seen as the arbiter of European politics. He was playing poker with an empty hand, betting the blood of his people on games he could not win. It was during this period of reckless gambling that the dark gravity of Berlin began to pull at him. For years, Mussolini had looked down on Adolf Hitler. He considered the German leader a vulgar imitator, a bad copy of himself. When they first met in Venice in 1934, Mussolini had strutted in his uniform while Hitler, wearing an ill-fitting trench coat, looked like a nervous clerk. Mussolini had mocked Hitler's long, rambling monologues. He had called Mein Kampf boring. He believed he was the senior partner in the Fascist International, the master teaching the apprentice. But by 1937, the dynamic had shifted. Germany was rearming at a terrifying speed. The Rhineland had been remilitarized. The bad copy was becoming a superpower, and Mussolini, with his keen instinct for power, felt a chill of insecurity. He needed to see it for himself. In September 1937, he traveled to Germany for a state visit that would prove to be the turning point of his life. Hitler, who shrewdly understood Mussolini's psychology, prepared a seduction on a Wagnerian scale. He did not treat Mussolini as a rival. He treated him as an idol. The entire German nation was turned into a stage set for the Duce's ego. When Mussolini arrived, he was greeted by millions of cheering Germans. The organization was flawless, the discipline absolute, but the climax came at the Mayfeld in Berlin. Under a cathedral of searchlights that pierced the night sky, addressing a crowd of nearly 1 million disciplined, silent soldiers, Mussolini was overwhelmed. He stood on the podium, forcing his jaw out, trying to project his usual dominance, but inside he was shaken. He looked at the endless rows of steel helmets, the precision of the marching columns, the sheer industrial might of the Third Reich. He compared it to the chaotic, emotional crowds in Rome, and he felt small. He realized that his own fascism was a theater production made of papier-mâché, while Hitler's Nazism was a machine made of croup steel. The envy consumed him. He returned to Italy a changed man. He was no longer the master. He was the mesmerized follower. He wanted to make Italy like Germany. He wanted to remove the softness of the Italian character and replace it with Prussian hardness. He began to introduce the goose step to the Italian army, a ridiculous sight for soldiers, unaccustomed to such rigidity. He was trying to clone the German soul and transplant it into an Italian body. This desperate need to impress Hitler led to the most shameful chapter of his dictatorship, the racial laws of 1938. Until that point, anti-Semitism had not been a central pillar of Italian fascism. Mussolini had even had Jewish mistresses and Jewish financiers. But Hitler hated Jews. So Mussolini decided he must hate them too. It was a cynical, bureaucratic decision. He stripped Italian Jews of their rights, fired them from universities, and banned them from public life. There was no political necessity for this. The Italian people were largely horrified. It was a ritual sacrifice offered to the German idol. Mussolini was mutilating his own country just to show Hitler that he, too, could be ruthless. The trap snapped shut in May 1939 with the signing of the Pact of Steel. The name was aggressive, chosen by Mussolini to sound invincible. In reality, the treaty was a suicide pact. It bound Italy to Germany in the event of war, stripping Mussolini of his freedom to maneuver. He signed it without even reading the fine print, trusting Hitler's verbal assurance that there would be no war for at least 3 years. It was an act of criminal negligence. Mussolini was so eager to stand shoulder to shoulder with the giant that he didn't check to see if he was being led off a cliff. When Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, shattering the promise of peace, Mussolini was caught in a nightmare of his own making. He received the news with horror. He knew deep down that Italy was broken. The army had no boots. The artillery was from World War I. The tanks were sardine cans that could barely stop a rifle bullet. He had spent years boasting of 8 million bayonets, but the warehouses were empty. The bluster of the balcony collided with the hard math of logistics. He had to do the one thing his ego could not bear. He had to declare non-belligerence. He had to sit on the sidelines while Hitler conquered Europe. It was a humiliation that burned him physically. As the German armies swept through Poland, then Norway, then France, Mussolini paced the halls of the Palazzo Venezia like a caged animal. He raged at his generals. He raged at the Italian people, calling them sheep and materialistic for not being ready to die. He was jealous of Hitler's victories. He felt that history was leaving him behind. The delusion twisted into a new desperate form. He convinced himself that the war would be short. He believed that if he jumped in at the very last second, he could claim a seat at the peace table and a share of the spoils without having to do any real fighting. He famously told his chief of staff, "I only need a few thousand dead so that I can sit at the peace conference as a man who has fought." It was the calculation of a vulture. On June 10, 1940, with France already collapsing under the German blitzkrieg, Mussolini went to the balcony. The crowd was somber. There was no joy in the square, only a heavy, foreboding silence. Mussolini declared war on Britain and France. He shouted, he postured, he promised glory. But the magic was gone. The people knew the truth. They were being dragged into a slaughter to soothe the wounded vanity of an old man who could not bear to be the second fiddle. The empire of illusions had declared war on reality, and reality was about to shoot back. The war did not reveal the strength of the fascist state. It peeled back the skin to reveal the skeleton, and the skeleton was made of dust. By the winter of 1940, the delusion of the short war had evaporated. Mussolini had sent his soldiers into the freezing mountains of Greece with cardboard boots and insufficient ammunition, promising them a glorious walkover. He had famously boasted that he would break the kidneys of Greece. Instead, the Greeks fought back with ferocious tenacity, pushing the Italians back into Albania. For the first time, the warrior nation was the laughingstock of Europe. Mussolini sat in the Palazzo Venezia, raging at the map, blaming the weather, blaming the generals, blaming the Italian race itself. He refused to accept that the failure was his. He screamed that the Italians were soft, that they needed to be beaten into shape, projecting his own strategic impotence onto the bodies of the soldiers dying in the snow. As the military disasters mounted, the loss of East Africa, the surrender in North Africa, the freezing hell of the Russian front, Mussolini's own body began to collapse in sympathy with his empire. The man of steel was rusting. His gastric ulcer, which had plagued him for years, returned with a vengeance. He was in constant crippling pain. The man who had once stripped to the waist to harvest grain now looked haggard and shrunken. His face turned a sallow yellowish gray. He lost weight rapidly, his skin hanging loosely on his frame, his eyes retreating into dark, bruised sockets. He spent days in bed, doubled over, living on a diet of milk and pap, unable to digest solid food. The physical vitality that was the cornerstone of his propaganda was gone. He stopped appearing on the balcony. He knew he could no longer hold the pose. The god had withdrawn into the temple because he was too sick to be seen. The psychological toll was even more severe. Mussolini swung between manic optimism and catatonic depression. He began to detach from reality completely. When reports arrived detailing the lack of fuel or the destruction of Italian cities by Allied bombers, he dismissed them. He spent hours correcting grammar mistakes in newspaper articles while his country burned. He became obsessed with trivialities. He believed that if he could just find the right slogan, the right rhetorical gesture, the war would turn. He was like a magician whose wand had snapped, still waving the broken stick, waiting for the rabbit to appear. He clung to the belief that Hitler had a secret weapon that would save them all at the last minute. He was no longer leading, he was waiting. By July 1943, the war had come home. The Allies landed in Sicily. Rome was bombed for the first time. The silence of the Italian people was broken not by cheers, but by the sirens of air raids. The pact with the people was null and void. The fascist Grand Council, a body of sycophants that Mussolini had ignored for years, finally decided to act. On the night of July 24th, they summoned the Duce to a meeting. Mussolini arrived feeling confident. He believed he could still mesmerize them with his voice. He spoke for 2 hours, a rambling, disjointed monologue trying to justify his war, trying to blame everyone else. But the magic was dead. The room was hot, stuffy, and silent. For the first time in 20 years, his audience did not applaud. They voted. By a margin of 19-7, they passed a resolution to transfer command of the armed forces to the king. It was a polite bureaucratic coup. Mussolini was voted out of his own dictatorship. The next day, the delusion reached its peak absurdity. Mussolini went to his office as usual, ignoring the vote. He believed the king would never dare to touch him. He went to a meeting with King Victor Emmanuel III, expecting a discussion on strategy. Instead, the king was cold. He informed Mussolini that he was dismissed. As Mussolini stumbled out of the royal villa, confused and dazed, he was not met by his black-shirted guards. He was met by the carabinieri. He was shoved into an ambulance, not for his health, but to hide him, and driven away under arrest. There was no uprising. There was no civil war. The fascist party, which claimed to have millions of fanatical warriors, simply evaporated. The Italians did not fight for their Duce. They tore down his posters and spat on his emblems. The granite block of fascism turned out to be sand. Mussolini was moved from prison to prison, eventually ending up at a hotel on top of the Gran Sasso mountain, the highest peak in the Apennines. He was a broken man. He told his captors he was finished with politics. He wanted to retire to a country house and write his memoirs. He was an old man who just wanted to be left alone with his ulcer. But history was not done with him yet. Hitler needed his puppet. On September 12, 1943, in a daring raid, German paratroopers led by Otto Skorzeny landed gliders on the mountain and rescued him. The photos of that rescue tell the entire story of his fall. Mussolini stands next to the giant, grinning German commandos. He is wearing a heavy black coat and a hat pulled low. He looks tiny, frail, and bewildered. There is no defiance in his eyes, only a profound weariness. He looks like a piece of luggage being transported by the true masters of Europe. He did not want to be rescued. He knew that going back meant returning to the slaughter, but he had no choice. He was flown to Germany, where he met Hitler. The Führer was disappointed. He expected the old lion, he got a ruin. But Hitler ordered him to return to Italy and set up a new fascist state in the north. Mussolini begged to be allowed to retire. Hitler screamed at him. The roles were completely reversed. The teacher was now the slave. He was sent back to northern Italy to establish the Italian Social Republic, headquartered in the small town of Salo on Lake Garda. It was a phantom state, a country that existed only on paper. Mussolini was its head, but he had no power. Every decision, every appointment, every military order had to be approved by the German generals. He lived in the Villa Feltrinelli, a prisoner in his own palace. The windows were shuttered, the gardens were patrolled by SS guards who saluted him but reported on his every move. He spent his days reading German philosophy and waiting for the end. He knew it was a farce. He called himself the mayor of Gargnano. He admitted to a visitor, "I am here only to suffer." In this twilight kingdom, the violence became even more grotesque because it was pointless. The Republic of Salo had no army to fight the Allies, so it turned its weapons on its own people. It became a regime of torture chambers and firing squads, hunting down partisans and Jews to please the Germans. Mussolini signed the death warrants. He even signed the death warrant of his own son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano, the husband of his favorite daughter, Edda, who had voted against him at the Grand Council. He did it not out of strength, but out of weakness. He was terrified that Hitler would think he was soft if he spared his own family. He sacrificed his own flesh and blood to the idol of the Axis. The body politics had reached its terminal phase. The Duce was now a ghost haunting a villa on a lake. He was visibly decaying. His eyes were watery. His hands shook, and he shuffled when he walked. He was a man already dead, kept upright only by the strings of the German puppeteers. He knew the war was lost. He knew the Allies were marching up the peninsula. He knew the partisans were closing in from the mountains, but he could not stop. He was trapped in the machinery he had built. He continued to give speeches over the radio, his voice sounding tinny and distant, promising victory, promising vengeance, speaking of secret weapons that everyone knew did not exist. It was the final pathetic performance of an actor who refuses to leave the stage, even after the lights have been turned off and the theater is empty. The tragedy was hurtling toward its violent conclusion, and the body that had once been worshipped was about to be desecrated. By April 1945, the Republic of Salo was not a government. It was a waiting room for death. The Allied armies were crossing the Po River, crushing the last German defenses. The partisans, once scattered bands of rebels, were now a disciplined army descending from the mountains, seizing cities and exacting vengeance. Mussolini, isolated in his villa on Lake Garda, spent his final days clutching at straws. He began to talk of a redoubt in Valtellina, a mythical fortress in the Alps, where he and his most loyal black shirts would make a glorious last stand, holding out until the Americans arrived to save them from the communists. It was his final delusion. There were no fortifications in Valtellina. There were no loyal legions waiting to die for him. There was only snow and silence. But he ordered his staff to pack the files, the gold, and the archives. He was preparing to stage the final act of his opera, even if he had to build the set himself. On April 18th, he left the villa for the last time. He did not look like a douche. He was shrunken, his skin gray and papery, his eyes darting with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. He traveled to Milan, the city where fascism was born, hoping to find a political solution. He set up his headquarters in the prefecture, surrounded by SS guards who were there as much to watch him as to protect him. The city was in chaos. Strikes were paralyzing the factories. The sound of gunfire drew closer every hour. Mussolini sat in an office, shuffling papers, waiting for a miracle. He granted an interview to a journalist, telling him, "My star has fallen. I have no illusions left." It was a rare moment of clarity. quickly swallowed by a return to fantasy. He began to speak of handing power over to the Socialist Party, as if he were still a prime minister with the authority to negotiate. The final humiliation came on the afternoon of April 25th at the Archbishop's Palace in Milan. Mussolini met with Cardinal Schuster, hoping the church would mediate a surrender that would guarantee his safety. While they sat in the cardinal's study, news arrived that the German army in Italy was already negotiating a secret surrender with the Allies. They hadn't told him. The Pact of Steel was revealed as a lie. Mussolini flew into a rage. He had sacrificed his nation, his honor, and his people for Hitler, and in the end, the Germans had treated him like a piece of luggage to be discarded. "They have betrayed me," he screamed. He stormed out of the palace. The delusion of the Axis partnership was shattered. He was alone. Panic set in. He decided to flee. He did not go to the mythical fortress in Valtellina. He simply ran. A convoy was assembled, a pathetic funeral procession of fascist hierophants, his mistress Claretta Petacci, and a column of retreating German soldiers. They headed north toward the Swiss border, driving through the rain along the western shore of Lake Como. The road was a gauntlet of fear. Every village they passed was hostile. The bells of the churches were ringing, signaling the uprising. The man who had once traveled these roads in an open-top sports car, waving to cheering crowds, was now huddled in the back of an armored car, terrified of being recognized. On the morning of April the 27th, near the town of Dongo, the convoy was stopped by a roadblock. It was the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade, a partisan unit. They were outnumbered by the Germans, but they had the moral high ground. Negotiations began. The partisans agreed to let the Germans pass, but no Italians. They knew fascist officials were hiding in the column. The German commander, wanting to save his own men, agreed to the terms. He didn't care about Mussolini anymore. The Duce was a liability. This is the moment where the body politics reaches its absolute nadir. Faced with the prospect of capture, Mussolini did not draw his pistol. He did not stand tall and demand to be treated as a head of state. He chose to hide. He was told to put on a disguise. He stripped off his Italian marshal's uniform, the uniform he had designed, covered in ribbons and gold braid, and put on the greatcoat of a German corporal. It was too big for him. He put on a German helmet, pulling it low over his eyes to hide his bald head. He put on dark sunglasses. The man, who had spent 20 years projecting an image of unique, unmistakable virility, was now trying to become invisible. He climbed into the back of a German truck, sitting among the fuel drums and sea bags. He huddled in the corner, pretending to be a drunken soldier, asleep. He held a submachine gun on his lap, but his hands were shaking too much to use it. This was the reality of the Roman Caesar, an old man trembling in a borrowed coat, hiding behind the men he had once claimed to lead. The partisans inspected the trucks. They checked papers. They looked at faces. One partisan, a man named Urbano Lazzaro, climbed onto the back of the third truck. He saw a figure slumped in the corner looking unlike the others. The disguise was pathetic. The expensive riding boots gave him away. The shape of the head was unmistakable. Lazzaro tapped him on the shoulder. The figure did not move. Lazzaro said, "Camerata." No response. Then Lazzaro removed the sunglasses. The eyes, the famous, bulging, hypnotic eyes that had stared down from every wall in Italy, stared back at him, wide with terror. "Excuse me," Lazzaro said, mocking the formal title. "Knight Mussolini?" The denial died in his throat. Mussolini nodded slowly. "I am Mussolini," he whispered. It was a surrender of the flesh. He was pulled down from the truck. He did not fight. He looked dazed, like a man waking up from a long, feverish dream. The German soldiers in the truck did not lift a finger to help him. They watched him go with indifference. The god was dragged onto the asphalt of a provincial road, surrounded by young men with rifles, who looked at him not with awe, but with curiosity and disgust. He was taken to the town hall of Dongo. The news spread like wildfire. The villagers gathered screaming for his blood. To keep him alive, the partisans moved him to a remote farmhouse in the hills, along with Claretta Petacci, who had demanded to stay with him. That night, in a small, cold room, Mussolini sat on a wooden chair. He refused to eat. He stared at the wall. The vast machinery of the state, the secret police, the armies, the propaganda, it was all gone. All that was left was a stomach ulcer and a fear of death. He asked the partisans if he would be put on trial. He still believed in some corner of his delusional mind that he could talk his way out of this. He thought he could stand before a jury and explain that it was all a misunderstanding, that he had saved Italy. He did not realize that the trial had already happened, and the verdict had been delivered by 20 years of suffering. The stage was gone. The audience was coming for him, and this time they didn't want a speech. They wanted the meat. The final act did not take place in a palace or a battlefield, but in front of a rusted iron gate on a quiet country lane. On the afternoon of April 28, 1945, a man named Walter Odizio, a communist partisan, using the nom de guerre Colonel Valerio, arrived at the farmhouse where the prisoners were being held. He was a man in a hurry carrying a death sentence that had been issued not by a court, but by the brutal necessity of history. He entered the room where Mussolini and Claretta Petacci were waiting. He did not read a verdict. He simply told them, "I have come to liberate you." It was the last lie Mussolini would ever hear. They were hurried into a car and driven a short distance to the Via Belmonte in the village of Giulino di Mezzegra. The car stopped on a narrow road flanked by a stone wall. Audizio ordered them out. Mussolini moved slowly, his face heavy with confusion. He still seemed to believe that this was a transfer, a negotiation. He did not understand that he had ceased to be a political figure and had become merely a problem to be disposed of. Audizio motioned them to stand against the wall. The silence of the countryside was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of thunder. Audizio raised his submachine gun. He announced, "By order of the General Command of the Corps of Volunteers for Liberty, I am entrusted with administering justice to the Italian people." Mussolini's eyes widened. The realization finally hit him. He was not looking at a negotiator, he was looking at an executioner. In a final pathetic irony, Audizio pulled the trigger and the gun jammed. The weapon of the proletariat, justice, failed. Audizio cursed, fumbling with the mechanism. Mussolini stood frozen. He did not beg. He did not pray. He simply waited. Audizio grabbed a pistol from another partisan. That gun jammed too. Finally, he borrowed a French MAS submachine gun from a third man. He aimed again. This time, the mechanism worked. 5 bullets struck Mussolini. He crumpled to the wet grass. He did not die instantly. He convulsed, breathing heavily. Audizio stepped forward and fired a final bullet into his heart. Claretta Petacci, who had thrown herself across his body in a final act of hysterical devotion, was killed instantly. The man of Providence, the founder of the empire, lay in a heap of mud and blood, wearing ill-fitting clothes, killed by a borrowed gun on the side of a dirt road. There were no last words. There was no Roman salute, just the dull thud of a body hitting the earth. But the death was not the end. The body politics required a public finale. The execution in secret was not enough. The idol had to be destroyed in the sight of the believers. The bodies were loaded onto a moving van. thrown on top of one another like carcasses from a slaughterhouse. They were driven south through the night toward Milan. They arrived at 3 a.m. on April 29th. The destination was chosen with cruel precision: Piazzale Loreto. This was the same square where, months earlier, the fascists had executed 15 partisans and left their bodies on display to terrorize the city. Now, the debt was being repaid. The partisans dumped the bodies on the pavement near a gas station under construction. Mussolini, Petacci, and several other executed fascist hierarchs were left in a pile. In the gray light of dawn, the city began to wake up. Word spread. He is here. The first onlookers arrived cautiously, prodding the bodies with their feet to make sure the monster was truly dead. As the sun rose, the trickle of people became a flood. Thousands of Milanese poured into the square. What followed was a release of 20 years of repressed rage. The crowd did not mourn. They attacked. They surged forward, breaking the line of partisan guards. A woman fired 5 shots into Mussolini's body, screaming that she was avenging her 5 dead sons. Others kicked the corpse in the head. They spat on him. One man urinated on the face that had once been plastered on every wall in the nation. The physical abuse was horrific, but it was symbolic. They were desacralizing the object. They were proving to themselves that the Superman was made of meat, that he could bleed, that he could rot. The face was smashed beyond recognition. The jaw, that famous jutting jaw, was unhinged. The eyes were swollen shut. The Roman mask was physically obliterated. The chaos grew dangerous. The crowd threatened to crush the bodies completely. To restore order and to make the display visible to everyone, the partisans made a decision that would sear itself into the global consciousness. They tied ropes around the ankles of the corpses and hoisted them up to the steel girder of the Standard Oil gas station. Mussolini swung upside down. Gravity did the rest. His heavy coat fell open, exposing his pale, flabby stomach. His arms dangled uselessly. The blood rushed to his head, turning his face a dark purple color. It was the ultimate inversion of the hierarchy. For 2 decades, he had stood on the high balcony looking down on the masses as a god. Now he hung above them as a piece of meat, and they looked up his nose. The mystery was gone. The distance was gone. In this grotesque position, the tragedy of the delusion was laid bare. Beside him hung Claretta Petacci. A priest, showing the only mercy of the day, climbed up a ladder to pin her skirt to her legs, preserving a shred of modesty in the midst of the carnage. The crowd cheered, laughed, and threw vegetables. It was a carnival of death. The virile body that had threshed grain and skied the Alps was now a pendulum of rotting flesh. Eventually, the American troops arrived and ordered the bodies to be taken down. Mussolini was transported to the city morgue. Even in death, the scrutiny continued. An autopsy was performed. The doctors were looking for a physical cause for his madness: a tumor, the scars of syphilis, anything that could explain the catastrophe he had unleashed. They found nothing. His brain was normal. His heart was healthy. There was no biological monster inside him. He was just a man. The evil was not a disease of the tissue. It was a disease of the ego. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a pauper cemetery, his name stripped from the record. For years, his body would be stolen, hidden, and moved by neo-fascists and the government, a restless ghost that Italy could not figure out how to lay to rest. But the story effectively ended in that square. The legacy of Benito Mussolini is not the empire he promised, nor the new man he tried to create. His legacy is the warning written in blood on the pavement of Piazzale Loreto. He showed the world the terrifying fragility of the human mind when it is fed by unlimited power and unlimited flattery. He proved that a nation can be seduced by a performance, that a people can fall in love with a mask, and that the price of that delusion is always paid in ruins. The untold story is that there was no Il Duce. There was only Benito, the blacksmith's son, who shouted loud enough to make the world believe he was a giant, until the silence of reality finally caught up with him. And when the curtain fell, there was nothing left but a cold wind blowing across a gas station in Milan, and the echo of a crowd trying to wash its hands of the monster they had helped to create.